Obviously, the intervention of the United States in Ethiopian politics is very troublesome and annoying these days. The US is crossing the red line, interfering in Ethiopian internal affairs by breaching the sovereignty of the country. And recently, the well-known political economic analyst who served in Africa for about 3 decades has tweeted on his personal social media that the UN should revise and resee its policy that is designated to Ethiopia particularly. And he urged the US government to think and see its policy on Ethiopia. A well-known political economic analyst, Lawrence Freeman. Good to have you.
Good to be with you again.
As I have said now, you served in African politics and in African matters for about 3 decades and plus. And can you highlight us about political economy of African continent during your stay for about 3 decades and so?
Yes, I've been involved in Africa for over 30 years as a economic political analyst, and I specialize in what I call physical economy. That is the actual development of the economy that will lead to the improvement of the standard of living of the population. And what has become clear to me over time, and actually is reinforced every time I visit Africa, which I have already done several times this year, is the lack of basic physical infrastructure is killing Africa. The lack of electricity is a killer for Africa. The lack of railroads connecting the country is retarding its economic development. Just these 2 factors alone lead to millions of people suffering and dying because of basic economic infrastructure. This is pervasive all over the continent. My estimates are that Africa needs at least 1,000 gigawatts of new electrical power, and I would suggest nuclear energy. And Africa needs at least 50,000 kilometers of high-speed rail to connect the east, west, north, and south ports, internal cities, and capitals. This should have been done decades ago. And every African nation and its people are suffering from the lack of infrastructure. In my mind, there's nothing more important. And that all the pro-African groups and human rights groups and UN resolutions on development, they all are empty unless they focus on a brute force mobilization to get electricity, railroads, roads, etc. for African nations. If they don't include that as a top priority, then they are not being relevant to the African people.
Okay, you're also very keen about Ethiopian politics as well. And during your stay for about 34 years, you have been looking into Ethiopian politics, not only the continent. You have been involving and researching by going to each nation states in the continent Africa. And can you particularly tell us your experience in Ethiopia and how do you see Ethiopian politics during the regime of TPLF?
The thing that was most impressive to me about Ethiopia is that it has a bold vision for economic development. I mean, it is still a relative poor country, emerging country, and with 110 million people. And there's still a lot of areas where development is not taking place in Ethiopia. Yet the government has very aggressively been promoting the right kind of infrastructure projects which many other countries in Africa have not. I've looked at both the two growth transformation plans that Ethiopia had previously. I was on the inaugural train debut of the Addis Ababa to Djibouti Railroad. Ethiopia is now moving to build and operate the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which would bring 6,200 megawatts of power, 6.2 gigawatts. This is the most significant development on the entire continent of Africa, is bringing electricity to East Africa. This is, to my mind, absolutely essential and critical, and will change East Africa, and therefore will change Africa. These kinds of bold plans, Ethiopia has a large future plan for transportation of roads, light manufacturing, such as the Hawassa plant, Hawassa area. All these things combined indicate that Ethiopia is trying to break through from the previous policies on the continent to have a more modern light manufacturing economy. And manufacturing is essential. You will not be able to build and sustain a sovereign economy unless you have manufacturing. And this was the key to the success of the United States, led by our first Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, and has been the key to our success over 2 centuries, is our focus on infrastructure and manufacturing. And that's exactly what Africa needs. And I see that Ethiopia is trying to lead the way in those 2 primary areas for economic development.
Recently, you tweeted by urging the US government to amend its foreign policy that is designated to Ethiopia. And could you highlight us about it, and would you like to recite it again?
The United States right now is proceeding on a very bad course for Africa and for Ethiopia in particular. Our foreign policy towards the continent is very weak, and our foreign policy towards Africa, towards Ethiopia, is actually extremely dangerous. This is being led by Secretary of State Antony Blinken, but also supported by the Special Envoy Feltman, also the Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, the head of USAID, Samantha Powers. They are proceeding on a course that could, if it was fully carried out, lead to the fragmentation of Ethiopia and the weakening of the Ethiopian nation state. Therefore, what I'm suggesting is that the Biden administration, and how much President Biden knows about this, I have no idea, but that the leadership of his nation that is representing his foreign policy should reverse course immediately. We should end the sanctions to Ethiopia. We should restore the money for development. And we should be supporting Prime Minister Dr. Abiy Ahmed in his efforts to protect and maintain the integrity and sovereignty of the Ethiopian nation state. It is very clear now, whatever doubts people had before, that the TPLF, not necessarily the Tigrayan people, and the Oromo Liberation Army are joining together to essentially either overthrow the government in Addis or to fragment the country so that it's no longer one cohesive, integrated unit of a nation state. And therefore, the actions by the prime minister should be supported, and we're undermining them, US policy. Don't forget, US policy does not speak for me and does not necessarily speak for my country, the United States of America. It represents a small group of people who have a perverted ideological view of geopolitics in the world. And their view right now could lead them to undermine Ethiopia and actually destabilize the entire Horn of Africa if they were allowed to be carried out.
Does the United States of America need to see a very stable or destabilized Horn of Africa?
Well, if you think about it, the nation state is a concept. It was developed a few hundred years ago. And as a concept, it's essential because you have generations of people who are born and then they pass away many generations later. The government, the state, carries on. It continues a policy from one generation to the next, from one century to the next. You need the nation state if society is going to exist. We have not invented anything yet superior to the nation state. Now, Ethiopia represents a nation. There are problems in Ethiopia's history, and there are good points about its history. The problems are, as a compromise, it accepted regional ethnicity in its government form and dividing up its states along regional ethnic lines. That was a mistake. I understand why it was done, but it was nevertheless a mistake because the fundamental identity of Ethiopians should not be their regional ethnicity or where they were born. We are all created in the image of the Creator with a divine spark for creativity of our minds. That makes us all more alike, and where we come from does not define who we are or what group we come from or what religion we come from. We have to affirm and reaffirm the idea of an Ethiopian identity of the Ethiopian state. Various parts of Ethiopia can maintain their culture that enriches the state, but to have people to say, we are going to separate from the state, we are no longer part of Ethiopia, we don't recognize Ethiopia. Well, in fact, that's treason. And what's happening now is the United States and Europe do not understand necessarily the danger that they're involving themselves in. But you have to realize there's a small group of people, political economic elite, we can call them an oligarchy. They don't represent any country. They represent their own political financial interest, but they've insinuated themselves in every country. They don't want to see a strong, stable Ethiopia. They don't want to see a strong, stable Horn of Africa. If countries are in chaos, if countries are in war, if countries are destabilized, then this political economic elite estimates that it can rule more effectively by manipulation. And so until we have strong economic countries that cannot be manipulated by outside forces, Africa is still struggling. Therefore, I support every nation and every leader, whatever their imperfections are, that fights for sovereignty and fights to be a strong nation. I usually end up supporting them. And I understand that the ideological, geopolitical doctrine of this financial political oligarchy is against the interest of strong, economically sovereign nation states like Ethiopia. So the US government and Europe and the UN, if they had any brains, would be supporting Prime Minister Abiy in his effort to hold the country together. But intelligence and leadership is still not a strong point of the West at this point. I hope to change that. And that's why the Biden administration should take the lead and reverse its policies, recognize they've been a mistake, and support the policies to maintain the nation state of Ethiopia.
Is there a probability in which the Biden administration would amend and resee the designated policy which goes directly to Ethiopia? You know what I mean? What has to be done from Ethiopian government side to have another policy which favors the benefit of Ethiopia and the bilateral relation of US and Ethiopia as well?
The problem does not lie with Ethiopia. The problem lies with geopolitics. There's a doctrine that's been around since the beginning of the British Empire in the 1600s called geopolitics. The geopolitics says that the world is has a fixed sum. It doesn't grow. And therefore, if you want to be a superior country, you have to be on top. You have to be a winner. You have to have more political power. You have to have more financial power. And you have to make sure everybody else is a loser. It's winners and losers in a fixed sum game. That's geopolitics. My understanding of the world is completely different. I see the world as a developing, expanding, and potentially unlimited development of people and economic conditions. So I don't see it as a fixed sum. I see it as a constantly growing capability and potential for development. But under the geopolitical doctrine, they see a country that is standing up strong for itself, trying to be a sovereign nation, as an impediment to their political economic control. In effect, there's nothing Ethiopia can do that change its policy. Its policy should be open and friendly to the West, but it has to consider what is necessary for its own development. For example, Ethiopia, like many countries in Africa, is working closely with China and China's Belt and Road. And this is attacked and maligned by the West, but that's part of their foolishness. That China is building infrastructure. China is helping countries in Africa develop energy, develop railroads, develop roads, develop schools. This is the right policy. The United States should be supporting that policy. Now, at what point the Biden administration recognizes the danger of not supporting Prime Minister Abiy against this effort to fragment the country, I don't know when that will occur or if that will occur. The danger, though, is if the policy continues the way that the Biden administration and governments of Europe are proceeding, then we could have more chaos and more destabilization in Ethiopia. I do think the Ethiopian government has to find a way, without compromising to the groups that are trying to undermine the country, nevertheless has to find a path towards ending the war and towards stability, and then concentrating on the policies of economic development for its people.
By the time Prime Minister Abiy took office, different Western medias and Western leaders acknowledged and appreciated his move and his efforts, particularly in negotiating the long foy between Ethiopia and Eritrean case and granting amnesty for so many prisoners and repatriating the contesting political parties who were in exile abroad and launching different mega projects and coining homegrown economy. All these were immunity for Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, and he has got a lot of appreciation from the Westerners, from the US, even from the US and the European Union, from United Kingdom, and Western media were appreciating and broadcasting about these all efforts. But through course of time, the US and the European Union had a point of departure. What was the point of departure which made the United States of America and the European Union to give a cold shoulder to Prime Minister Abiy's administration?
View from certain factions in the West who believe in a liberal democratic dictatorship of their views. They saw in the beginning that they thought that Prime Minister Abiy would be part of their global democracy dictatorship. I think when the Prime Minister formed the Prosperity Party, which was a non-ethnic based national party, and other things in support of that approach, he no longer was acceptable to what the West wanted. And you have to look at the situation in Tigray. I've been around African politics now for a long time, almost half my life. Mm-hmm. And I see things and I have a political nose for what's going on. And I was very much involved in Sudan for many, many years, trying to move the country in a more positive economic policy. And don't forget, President Bashir at one point was praised by George W. Bush for allowing the vote to take place for the separation of South Sudan, which I opposed. I don't believe in dividing up countries. And then you had the attack on a military post in Darfur, and everything changed. And the United States and the West went after Sudan for years and years. I'm looking at the situation in Tigray in a similar way. Was the Tigray intervention part of a trap to pull Ethiopia into a conflict that they hope people in the TPLF and others behind them would actually lead to the breakup of Ethiopia? It looks that way to me, that this is a setup, and that once Prime Minister Abiy responded, as I believe any president would, as I know President Abraham Lincoln did in 1861, when Fort Sumter was under attack from the Confederacy. He responded against an enemy that was actually treasonous. Attacking a military post is treason, it's insurrection. And he responded, and the more he responded, the more the West began to undermine and reduce their support for Ethiopia and for Prime Minister Abiy, because a certain political faction would rather see a divided Ethiopia, which would be a weakened Ethiopia, rather than a strong economic Ethiopia. So somewhere around the time that the Prime Minister made clear his intentions to unify the country and move ahead, I think people in the West realized that he was not going to be pliable and controllable and manipulable to their global democracy dictatorship. And you saw a dangerous shift in policy. In fact, you could say that the Biden administration is actually carrying out a worse policy toward Ethiopia than the Trump administration. And of course, the Trump administration policy was not very good. I don't know how or when President Biden, or if he will reverse his policy, but we have to say loud and clear, it's the wrong policy. The government, the Prime Minister, should be supported, especially now that both the TPLF and the OLA have made public their intent to break up the country. The TPLF has made clear they want to be a separate nation. Well, that's not acceptable in a nation state. So there is a danger now that if the United States and others continue to undermine the government and the Prime Minister, things may get worse. And therefore, sane voices who understand Africa and Ethiopia like I do have to make very clear that this would be a tragic mistake, a mistake that could be as bad or worse by the very same people who overthrew Gaddafi in October 2011. We're coming up on the 10-year anniversary. And look who was in the government then. President Obama, Vice President Biden, Susan Rice, Samantha Powers was then the ambassador. The same crew who advised the President of the United States to overthrow Gaddafi, which has killed hundreds of thousands of people and caused the suffering of millions of people from northeast Nigeria all the way across to Senegal, Burkina Faso, Algeria, Niger, Chad. That kind of mistake was catastrophic for Africa. And the same people are now could be driving Ethiopia and create another catastrophic mistake for Africa. So we should say no to these liberal Democrats. Stop your dangerous policies and support nation states like Ethiopia and other nations aspiring to be nation states in Africa.
Is there a probability in which the imperialists, what they have applied on Libya, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, so forth?
I think you have to make some kind of separation. I really don't know what President Biden thinks about Africa. I haven't heard him say anything about Africa. Usually, presidents, when they come into office, don't even consider an Africa policy until the second year. I don't think the president wants a war. I don't think the president wants to harm the people of Africa. But he has in place certain people like Secretary of State Anthony Blinken and people like Samantha Powers and others who may push the policy to that level. If you look at the memoirs of Robert Gates, who was the Secretary of Defense under the first 2 years of the Obama administration, in his book, he has a chapter on Libya because it occurred under his watch. And he identifies in that chapter that the most vocal militarist for the overthrow of Gaddafi was Samantha Powers. She was trying, according to him, trying to take over the Defense Department. So you have these people who pose as liberals, but underneath they have an oligarchical worldview. And they say, oh, human rights are being abused. Oh, good government is being abused. We have to correct this. We have to correct this. We have to have the rule of law. We have to have human rights. But they really don't care about human rights, because the most fundamental human right is the right to live. And to live, you need electricity. To live, you need clean water. To live, you need roads, and you need schools, and you need jobs, so you can go to work and bring home an income and provide a home and a stable life for your children so their lives are better than yours. These human rights activists, in my view, are frauds. And these people who call for democracy and the rule of law are frauds. Where is the rule of law in Ethiopia for these people? Prime Minister Abiy won an election. According to the rule of law, he is legitimately the prime minister. You have organizations like the TPLF and others who are trying to overthrow the government. That's a violation of the rule of law. So therefore, according to any reasonable interpretation of the rule of law, Prime Minister Abiy should be getting support from the West. Why impose sanctions, which makes it worse? Why cut back aid, which makes it worse? Why attack the government for ethnic cleansing and genocide when none of that has been proven? But they speak as if it's already been tried in the courts. These actions, under quote, their liberal views, are very dangerous, and they don't address the fundamental questions of how to improve life in Africa and how to strengthen nations in Africa. They're very dangerous people. Now, how much President Biden is committed to this view, I don't know. But this is where his administration is going at the moment, and it's very dangerous, and it should be stopped. And all sane Americans in Congress should be supporting my view, my understanding of Ethiopia, because it's superior to anything anyone else understands as an American.
Okay, in what way should the Ethiopian government could say no to their interference, though?
Well, I think the Ethiopian government has to pursue a policy that will advance the people of Ethiopia, an economic policy, a political policy, and a military policy. Now, the war, after 9 months, is clearly hurting the people of Ethiopia. On the other hand, the TPLF, and I listened to their leader the other day, one of their advisors on BBC, they want separation and they want to fragment the country. It's not ambiguous. At this point, 9 months after the war began, it is clearer than ever that the TPLF and now the OLA want to join in the destruction of the nation state of Ethiopia. That is a fundamental responsibility. It's a fundamental responsibility of the government to stop that. On the other hand, we have to be clever and think about how to defeat the enemy, but at the same time end the suffering of this long war. And that's a very difficult question, and that requires a lot of thought to figure out how to do that. But I don't think Ethiopia can count on any support from the West. If it happens, that's a plus. But right now, the West has shown a lack of understanding. Now, that could change. And therefore, the foreign policy of Ethiopia should always be open to discussion and dialogue with the government. But on the other hand, you can't base your entire policy on that. You have to think, what is the advantageous policy for our people? And I know that Ethiopia has the support of almost all of sub-Saharan Africa. And in the United States could come to a moment when they realize that if they continue the policies that they've had now for the last several months, it could disrupt the whole continent. Now, the other consideration from a geopolitical standpoint, not my standpoint, would be that the United States would recognize that by its policies towards Africa and towards Ethiopia in particular, they are opening the door for more involvement of Russia and China and other countries. And from their geopolitical standpoint, that might frighten them to also reverse the directions. They won't do it for the sake of Africa, but they'll do it for the sake of geopolitics. That's another possibility.
It's really puzzling. Their media these days broadcast and orchestrating as if the world Nobel Peace Prize winner is waging war on its own people. They're hooking the story that way.
Yes.
What does it mean by tragic maker, which is TPLF, attacked the military base, which is found in the northern part of the country? What would Biden do if he were on Abiy's post? Would he tolerate this atrocious act? And what do they really need from Abiy's administration? We are puzzling with this really amazing calculation.
Well, the problem is, first of all, in the experience of the United States, when we were attacked in April 12th, 1861, by the Confederacy, which were out to destroy the Union, President Lincoln declared war and called up 75,000 soldiers to join the army. The war lasted 4 years, and about 750,000 people died from the American-US Civil War. Very tragic. But on the other hand, Lincoln never gave in. He said the only people pressured him to have negotiations and a treaty, and a peace treaty. He said the only peace treaty I'll agree to is the unconditional surrender of the rebels from the South. So we've had experience in this. The reality of the situation is that one is the media is controlled by the same financial political oligarchy, the same media controlled by them. I've tried to condition my life not to be brainwashed by the media, because the media is an instrument at conditioning people to public opinion to not think for themselves. You have to think for yourself, and the media brainwashes people to go along with popular opinion on everything. So it's not surprising to me that most people believe the stories coming out of the media, because they would never take the time to think through and investigate for themselves what the actual nature is. Ethiopia has a rich, several thousand year long history, the last 120, 30 years since the Battle of Adwa are another branch of history. And people don't take the time to understand this the way I do. The problem that many people have, and the Africans have, but others, is they don't understand the way the United States works. We have elected representatives. We have elected president. We have an elected Congress. If the United States was operating on the cultural level of thinking that our founding fathers thought it would, then we would have more sophisticated and thoughtful elected representatives. The United States culture, our scientific thinking capability, our intelligence level has been declining over the last 50 years. We're actually being dumbed down. And our elected officials come from the population. So we don't have thinking leaders the way we used to. We don't have a President Abraham Lincoln. We don't have a President Kennedy. We don't have a President Franklin Roosevelt. We don't have a President John Quincy Adams. We don't have a brilliant genius like Alexander Hamilton with us today. We are dumber. And so therefore our politicians are dumber. Our policy is dumber. And therefore we are making more and more, we're submissive to this oligarchical elite that wants to drive their policies forward. What the leaders in Africa should understand is that these people do not necessarily represent the American people. They're a faction in our government. And therefore, Ethiopia has to appeal to the better nature of the United States, to what our real history is as a great country founded on profound principles of our founding fathers. Ethiopia has to appeal to those principles which are the better qualities of American citizens. Maintain peaceful relations with the government, but there's nothing you can do that's going to appease what the liberal democracy elite want for your country. You can't appease them. So there's no act you could take. For the betterment of your country, you have to proceed to end this conflict as soon as possible, and you have to aggressively move forward on your bold economic policies, which the GERD is the leading element of, but many other policies that I've discussed with people in Ethiopia as well have to be implemented.
Okay, Lawrence Freeman, one last question. Do you have anything to add to Ethiopian government in conjunction to the U.S. intervention and policy which is designated to hurt Ethiopia?
I think the government has achieved two major successes. It had a successful election and it had a successful filling of the GERD. But as a result of the intervention in Tigray starting last November, the country is being pulled downward or backward in a different direction. The leadership cannot let itself be diverted from its fundamental goal of economic development for its people, but at the same time has to think very creatively out of the box, as we say in the West, about how to bring this conflict to a close, to bring closure to this conflict, because the longer it goes on, the more suffering goes on. As in regard to the United States, keep a friendly, open, diplomatic relationship with the United States, but don't give in. I thought the fact that Prime Minister Abiy did not meet with Samantha Powers was good. Don't give in to the pressure from the West. Understand that it doesn't really represent in my country, the United States of America, but it represents a political faction, an international political faction that would like to see Ethiopia and other nations in Africa weaken. Look, where are the strong nations in Africa? South Africa has not transformed its economy, even though its political leadership did 30 years ago. Look at the conditions of most people in Africa. Look at the most African nations. Poverty, lack of electricity, lack of jobs. The continent could have 2.5 billion people 30 years from now. If we don't start investing in massive infrastructure policies today, conditions for the continent could be worse. Ethiopia plays a leading role in West Africa. I think Cote d'Ivoire is playing a leading role in West Africa. There are other important leaders in important countries. We have to come together, the leaders of Africa, and say what is primary for the benefit of our people. We need 50,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. We need 1,000 gigawatts of new electrical power. Let's put our heads together and develop a plan to build these kind of projects so that our people in Africa are no longer suffering. We have, 400 million plus people in poverty, 600 million people without access to electricity. This is criminal. These are criminal acts, and they have to stop. And that should be the goal of all thoughtful leaders in Africa and around the world, should be assisting Africa in developing this economic capability.
Thank you. Honorable Lawrence Freeman, a long-serving political economic analyst for Africa who served in Africa for about 34 years. Thank you for your analysis and thank you for standing beside the truth and voting on the reality. Have a good one. Bye-bye. Take care.
Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.